When most people in the United States think about ancient Egypt, the image that comes to mind is almost always the same: towering pyramids, golden mosques, powerful pharaohs, and mysterious hieroglyphs carved into stone. History books and documentaries often begin Egypt's story around 3000 BCE, with the rise of the first dynasties and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But this familiar starting point hides a far deeper and far more fascinating truth. Egypt did not suddenly appear as a fully formed civilization ruled by god-kings. Long before the first pharaoh wore a crown, thousands of years of human struggle, adaptation, innovation, and experimentation laid the foundation for everything that followed. To understand the real history of ancient Egypt, we must go back, before written records, before monuments, and even before the Nile looked the way it does today. This is the forgotten prehistory of Egypt, a story rarely told in school books, yet essential for understanding how one of the world's greatest civilizations truly began. Modern Egypt is defined by desert. Vast stretches of sand surround a narrow ribbon of fertile land along the Nile River. It is easy to assume that this landscape has always been the same. In reality, prehistoric Egypt was dramatically different. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, North Africa experienced what scientists call the Green Sahara period. Rainfall was far higher than it is today, transforming what is now barren desert into grasslands, lakes, and rivers. Wildlife such as cattle, antelope, giraffes, and even crocodiles thrived in regions that are now uninhabitable. Rock art discovered in the Sahara depicts hunting scenes, herding, and communal rituals, offering visual proof that humans once lived and prospered far beyond the Nile Valley. During this period, the Nile was not yet the sole lifeline of Egypt. People lived across wide areas, moving with seasonal rains and water sources. As the climate slowly became drier, these populations were forced to migrate toward the one permanent source of water that remained reliable: the Nile River. This gradual environmental pressure played a crucial role in shaping Egyptian civilization. Egypt was not chosen by fate. It was shaped by climate change. The earliest human presence in Egypt dates back tens of thousands of years. Stone tools show that hunter-gatherer groups lived along the Nile and in nearby regions, surviving through hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Over time, these communities became more settled, especially as environmental conditions pushed people closer together. Around 6,000 to 5,000 BCE, farming began to take hold. People started domesticating plants and animals, including wheat, barley, and cattle. This was not a sudden revolution, but a slow transition. Early farmers still hunted and gathered, but agriculture allowed them to stay in one place for longer periods. Permanent settlements began to appear along the Nile's floodplains. These early villages were small, simple, and practical. Houses were made from mud and reeds. Tools were fashioned from stone, bone, and wood. There were no palaces, no temples, and no kings. Power was local and likely based on age, skill, or social influence, rather than inherited authority. Yet even at this early stage, the roots of Egyptian culture were forming. The Nile River did more than provide water. It taught early Egyptians how to think about time, order, and survival. Each year, the river flooded its banks, depositing rich silt that made farming possible. Unlike the unpredictable floods of other rivers, the Nile's flooding was relatively regular and gentle. This consistency encouraged long-term planning. People learned when to plant, when to harvest, and how to store surplus food. Over time, these practices created food security, which in turn allowed population growth. As villages grew larger and closer together, cooperation became essential. Irrigation canals, flood management, and shared farmland required organization and collective effort. From this need for cooperation emerged the earliest forms of social structure. Certain individuals likely took on leadership roles, organizing labor or managing resources. These leaders were not yet pharaohs, but they were. the ancestors of later rulers. Religion did not suddenly appear with temples and priests. Its roots stretch deep into prehistoric Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows that early Egyptians buried their dead with care, often placing tools, pottery, and food in graves. This suggests a belief that life continued in some form after death. Graves also varied in size and richness, indicating early social differences. Some individuals were clearly more important or respected than others. These distinctions foreshadowed the rigid social hierarchy of later dynastic Egypt. Animals played a central role in early belief systems. Many creatures that later became sacred, such as falcons, cattle, crocodiles, and cats, were already symbolically important in prehistoric times. The natural world was not separate from the spiritual world. It was the spiritual world. These early beliefs laid the foundation for the complex religious system that would later define Egyptian civilization. As populations grew, regional cultures began to emerge along the Nile. Different areas developed distinct pottery styles, tools, burial customs, and artistic traditions. These differences show that Egypt was not culturally unified from the beginning. Instead, it was a patchwork of communities with their own identities. Trade networks expanded, connecting villages over long distances. Materials such as obsidian, copper, shells, and semi-precious stones traveled hundreds of miles. This exchange of goods also meant an exchange of ideas, technologies, and beliefs. Over time, competition increased. Some communities became wealthier and more powerful than others. Control over fertile land, trade routes, and labor became sources of conflict. Warfare, though limited, began to play a role in shaping society. This period marks a crucial transition. Egypt was moving from simple village life toward organized hierarchical society. By the late prehistoric period, signs of elite classes become unmistakable. Certain burial sites contain luxury goods, finely crafted objects, and evidence of long-distance trade. These elites likely controlled resources and labor, positioning themselves as leaders within their communities. Symbols of authority began to appear: ceremonial weapons, decorated pottery, and artistic motifs representing power and dominance. Some leaders may have claimed religious authority, presenting themselves as intermediaries between humans and the spiritual world. This combination of political and religious influence would later define the role of the pharaoh. But at this stage, power was still local and contested. As communities expanded, competition intensified. Archaeological evidence suggests that conflicts between regions became more frequent. Fortifications, weapons, and imagery depicting violence all point to a world that was becoming increasingly unstable. At the same time, cooperation across regions also increased. Shared religious symbols, artistic styles, and administrative practices began to spread. This tension between conflict and cooperation ultimately pushed Egypt toward political unification. By the end of the prehistoric period, the stage was set. The Nile Valley was home to organized societies, powerful leaders, shared beliefs, and growing inequalities. What it lacked was a single authority capable of bringing everything together. The prehistoric period of Egypt is often overlooked because it lacks the dramatic monuments and written records that make later history easier to teach. Pyramids are more visually striking than mud huts. Pharaohs are more memorable than farmers. But ignoring this period creates a distorted view of history. It suggests that civilization appears suddenly, fully formed, and guided by great individuals. The truth is far more human. Ancient Egypt was built slowly, by ordinary people responding to extraordinary challenges over thousands of years. Before there were pharaohs, there were families. Before there were temples, there were shared beliefs shaped by nature. Before there was divine kingship, there was cooperation born from survival. Understanding Egypt before history began does not diminish the achievements of later dynasties. It enhances them. The pyramids, the gods, and the pharaohs were not miracles. They were the final outcome of a long journey that began with climate change, migration, farming, belief, and human ingenuity. The unification of Egypt is often presented in school books as a simple, almost mythical event. A single powerful ruler rises, defeats his enemies, places two crowns upon his head, and instantly transforms scattered communities into one of the world's first great states. The reality, however, is far more complex, slower, and deeply human. Egypt did not become a kingdom overnight. Its unification was the result of centuries of political competition, economic pressure, religious symbolism, and evolving ideas about power and identity. To understand how Egypt was truly united, we must move beyond legends and examine the real forces that shaped the world's first territorial state. Long before Egypt was a single kingdom, it existed as two distinct regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. This naming may seem backward to modern readers, but it reflects the flow of the Nile River. Upper Egypt lay upstream, closer to the river's sources, while Lower Egypt was downstream, where the Nile spread into the fertile delta. These two regions were different in geography, resources, and culture. Upper Egypt was narrow and linear, tightly controlled by the Nile Valley. Lower Egypt was wide, marshy, and open to trade with the Mediterranean world. Their environments shaped different ways of life and different political traditions. Each region developed its own symbols of identity. Upper Egypt used the white crown, while Lower Egypt was associated with the red crown. Even gods, artistic styles, and burial practices varied. Egypt was not born united. It was divided by nature itself. As prehistoric villages grew into regional centers, competition became inevitable. Control over fertile land, trade routes, and labor determined survival and prosperity. By the late prehistoric period, powerful local rulers had emerged in both Upper and Lower Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows that some communities became dominant, absorbing or conquering their neighbors. This process was not peaceful. Weapons, fortified settlements, and violent imagery appear more frequently during this time. Egypt's unification was forged through conflict as much as cooperation. Upper Egypt, in particular, seems to have developed stronger political structures earlier than the north. Its geography made centralized control easier. Rulers could dominate long stretches of the Nile, controlling movement and trade. Over time, Upper Egyptian leaders gained an advantage that would prove decisive. Religion played a critical role in the unification process. Early rulers did not rely on force alone. They used belief to legitimize their power. Gods were no longer just local spirits tied to nature. They became political allies. Rulers began presenting themselves as chosen by the gods, protectors of cosmic order. This concept, later known as Ma'at, represented balance, harmony, and justice. A ruler who maintained order was seen as divinely approved. The ruler who failed threatened chaos. By linking political authority with religious duty, early kings made resistance, not just rebellion, but sacrilege. This strategy would define Egyptian kingship for the next 3,000 years. The name most often associated with Egypt's unification is Narmer. He is traditionally identified as the first king to unite Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE. His legacy is preserved in one of the most famous artifacts of ancient Egypt, the Narmer palette. The palette depicts Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. He is shown defeating enemies, standing larger than all other figures, symbolizing dominance and divine authority. But this artifact does not tell the full story. Rather than recording a single decisive battle, the Narmer palette is best understood as political propaganda. It celebrates the final stage of a long process, not a sudden event. Narmer likely inherited power structures built by generations before him. Unification was not a moment, it was a movement. Despite the religious symbolism, unification was not peaceful. Archaeological sites such as Hierakonpolis reveal evidence of warfare, destruction, and mass burials. Some communities were violently absorbed into expanding kingdoms. Lower Egypt, with its open geography and trade connections, was particularly vulnerable to conquest from the south. Upper Egyptian rulers likely advanced northward in stages, securing territory, imposing authority, and integrating local elites into the new system. Rather than wiping out existing leaders, successful rulers often co-opted them. Local elites were allowed to keep power in exchange for loyalty. This strategy reduced resistance and helped stabilize the growing state. True unification required more than conquest. It required administration. Early kings developed systems to manage land, labor, and resources across vast distances. The earliest forms of writing appeared during this period, primarily for accounting and record-keeping. Goods, taxes, offerings, and labor were tracked using symbols that would later evolve into hieroglyphs. Writing was not invented for poetry or storytelling. It was invented for control. Standardized measurements, seal impressions, and official iconography spread across the Nile Valley. These tools created a shared political language, making Egypt feel like a single entity, even before most people understood what a nation was. With unification came a new concept: kingship. The ruler was no longer just a powerful leader. He was the embodiment of the state itself. His body symbolized unity. His authority connected heaven and earth. This idea was reinforced through ritual architecture and art. Royal imagery became highly controlled and symbolic. The king was always shown calm, dominant, and eternal. This was not realism. It was ideology. Kingship was designed to appear timeless, unchanging, and divinely sanctioned. In reality, it was a fragile system that required constant reinforcement through ceremony, religion, and force. The double crown, combining the white and red crowns, was more than decoration. It was a political statement worn on the king's head for all to see. It reminded subjects that two lands had become one, and that separation was no longer acceptable. Even long after unification, Egyptian rulers continued to emphasize this symbolism. Titles such as King of Upper and Lower Egypt were repeated endlessly in inscriptions. Unity had to be constantly performed because it could always be undone. The early dynastic period was not a time of complete stability. Power struggles, short reigns, and regional tensions persisted. The kingdom could fracture if rulers were weak. This fragility explains why Egyptian culture became so conservative. Tradition was valued because change was dangerous. Stability became sacred. The past was idealized, and innovation was carefully controlled. Unification taught Egypt a powerful lesson. Order must be protected at all costs. Most textbooks simplify Egypt's unification into a neat story with a clear beginning and end. Version is easier to remember, but it hides the truth. Egypt was united not by destiny, but by human decisions. It was shaped by geography, climate pressure, violence, compromise, belief, and bureaucracy. Kings like Narmer were not miracle workers. They were the final actors in a long historical drama. Understanding this reality makes ancient Egypt more impressive, not less. It shows that one of the world's greatest civilizations was built through trial, error, and adaptation. Egypt's unification was not just about territory. It was about creating a shared identity. People who once saw themselves as members of villages or regions slowly came to see themselves as Egyptians. This identity would endure through invasions, dynastic collapses, and foreign rule. The idea of Egypt, born during this early period, proved stronger than any single king. By the end of this process, Egypt had become something entirely new, a centralized state with a divine ruler, a complex bureaucracy, and a powerful sense of order. The foundations were laid for pyramids, temples, and imperial ambition. But This kingdom was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by real people, facing real challenges. This is how Egypt was truly united, not in a single battle, but through centuries of struggle, strategy, and belief. The unification of Egypt is often portrayed as a dramatic turning point. One king, one victory, one nation born in a single moment. In classrooms and popular documentaries, the story usually begins and ends with a name carved into stone. Yet the truth is far more complex. Egypt was not united by a single battle or a single man. It was united through centuries of gradual change, competition, compromise, and ideology. To understand how Egypt truly became a kingdom, we must abandon the myth of sudden creation and examine the slow, fragile process that transformed scattered communities into the world's first centralized state. Before Egypt was a nation, it was two very different worlds. Upper Egypt stretched along the narrow Nile Valley in the south, where land was limited and communities were tightly packed. Lower Egypt lay in the north, where the Nile fanned out into a wide delta of marshes, channels, and fertile plains. These environments produced different political cultures. Upper Egypt favored centralized control because geography made movement and authority easier to manage. Lower Egypt, open to the Mediterranean, developed through trade and local autonomy. These regions had different artistic styles, burial customs, and religious traditions. The idea that Egypt was naturally destined to unite ignores these deep-rooted differences. Unity was not inevitable. It had to be enforced. As populations increased and agriculture expanded, competition intensified. Control of land, labor, and trade routes became a matter of survival. Archaeological evidence shows growing inequality, fortified settlements, and weapons appearing more frequently in the late prehistoric period. Small chiefdoms expanded into regional powers. The strongest absorbed weaker neighbors. Violence was not constant, but it was decisive. Political consolidation rewarded those who could organize labor, command loyalty, and intimidate rivals. Upper Egypt gained the upper hand early. Its geography allowed ambitious rulers to dominate long stretches of the river, giving them control over movement, trade, and resources. Force alone could not hold territory. Early rulers needed legitimacy. Religion provided it. Rulers began presenting themselves as defenders of cosmic order, later known as Ma'at. This concept represented balance, stability, and harmony. A ruler who maintained order was righteous. Rebellion became a threat not only to the king, but to the universe itself. This fusion of religion and politics was revolutionary. Authority was no longer temporary or negotiable. It became sacred. The king most famously associated with unification is Narmer. His image appears on the Narmer palette, where he is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. This artifact is often described as a historical record, but it is better understood as propaganda. It celebrates power, dominance, and divine approval. It does not describe the long struggle that made such imagery possible. Narmer was not the beginning. He was the conclusion. True unification required more than conquest. It required administration. Early kings developed systems to manage land, taxes, labor, and religious offerings. The earliest forms of writing emerged not for storytelling, but for accounting. Symbols recorded goods, property, and authority. Standardized imagery, royal seals, and shared religious symbols created a unified political language. Even people who never saw the king came to recognize his authority. This bureaucratic revolution turned conquest into governance. Unification did not end conflict. Early dynastic Egypt remained unstable. Power had to be constantly reinforced through ritual, symbolism, and force. Titles like King of Upper and Lower Egypt were repeated endlessly because unity was never guaranteed. Egypt learned a lasting lesson. Order must be protected at all costs. This belief shaped Egyptian civilization for the next 3,000 years. Egypt was not born from destiny. It was built by human decisions, by rulers who understood geography, fear, belief, and organization. Unification created not just a kingdom, but an identity. For the first time, people along the Nile began to think of themselves as part of something larger. This was the real birth of ancient Egypt. Egypt's unification was not just about territory, it was about creating a shared identity. People who once saw themselves as members of villages or regions slowly came to see themselves as Egyptians. This identity would endure through invasions, dynastic collapses, and foreign rule. The idea of Egypt, born during this early period, proved stronger than any single king. By the end of this process, Egypt had become something entirely new. A centralized state with a divine ruler, a complex bureaucracy, and a powerful sense of order. The foundations were laid for pyramids, temples, and imperial ambition. But this kingdom was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by real people facing real challenges. This is how Egypt was truly united, not in a single battle, but through centuries of struggle, strategy, and belief. The unification of Egypt is often portrayed as a dramatic turning point. One king, one victory, one nation born in a single moment. In classrooms and popular documentaries, the story usually begins and ends with a name carved into stone. Yet the truth is far more complex. Egypt was not united by a single battle or a single man. It was united through centuries of gradual change, competition, compromise, and ideology. To understand how Egypt truly became a kingdom, we must abandon the myth of sudden creation and examine the slow, fragile process that transformed scattered communities into the world's first centralized state. Before Egypt was a nation, it was two very different worlds. Upper Egypt stretched along the narrow Nile Valley in the south, where land was limited and communities were tightly packed. Lower Egypt lay in the north, where the Nile fanned out into a wide delta of marshes, channels, and fertile plains. These environments produced different political cultures. Upper Egypt favored centralized control because geography made movement and authority easier to manage. Lower Egypt, open to the Mediterranean, developed through trade and local autonomy. These regions had different artistic styles, burial customs, and religious traditions. The idea that Egypt was naturally destined to unite ignores these deep-rooted differences. Unity was not inevitable. It had to be enforced. As populations increased and agriculture expanded, competition intensified. Control of land, labor, and trade routes became a matter of survival. Archaeological evidence shows growing inequality, fortified settlements, and weapons appearing more frequently in the late prehistoric period. Small chiefdoms expanded into regional powers. The strongest absorbed weaker neighbors. Violence was not constant, but it was decisive. Political consolidation rewarded those who could organize labor, command loyalty, and intimidate rivals. Upper Egypt gained the upper hand early. Its geography allowed ambitious rulers to dominate long stretches of the river, giving them control over movement, trade, and resources. Force alone could not hold territory. Early rulers needed legitimacy. Religion provided it. Rulers began presenting themselves as defenders of cosmic order, later known as Ma'at. This concept represented balance, stability, and harmony. A ruler who maintained order was righteous. Rebellion became a threat not only to the king, but to the universe itself. This fusion of religion and politics was revolutionary. Authority was no longer temporary or negotiable. It became sacred. The king most famously associated with unification is Narmer. His image appears on the Narmer palette, where he is shown wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. This artifact is often described as a historical record, but it is better understood as propaganda. It celebrates power, dominance, and divine approval. It does not describe the long struggle that made such imagery possible. Narmer was not the beginning. He was the conclusion. True unification required more than conquest. It required administration. Early kings developed systems to manage land, taxes, labor, and religious offerings. The earliest forms of writing emerged not for storytelling, but for accounting. Symbols recorded goods, property, and authority. Standardized imagery, royal seals, and shared religious symbols created a unified political language. Even people who never saw the king came to recognize his authority. This bureaucratic revolution turned conquest into governance. Unification did not end conflict. Early dynastic Egypt remained unstable. Power had to be constantly reinforced through ritual, symbolism, and force. Titles like King of Upper and Lower Egypt were repeated endlessly because unity was never guaranteed. Egypt learned a lasting lesson. Order must be protected at all costs. This belief shaped Egyptian civilization for the next 3,000 years. Egypt was not born from destiny. It was built by human decisions, by rulers who understood geography, fear, belief, and organization. Unification created not just a kingdom, but an identity. For the first time, people along the Nile began to think of themselves as part of something larger. This was the real birth of ancient Egypt. Few structures in human history have inspired more mystery, speculation, and outright misinformation than the pyramids of ancient Egypt. To this day, they are often described as impossible feats, too precise, too massive, too advanced to have been built by ancient people using simple tools. Popular culture fills the gaps with aliens, lost civilizations, or forgotten super technologies. But the real story of how the pyramids were built is far more impressive than any fantasy. It is a story of organization, labor, engineering, political power, and human determination on a scale the ancient world had never seen before. The pyramids were not miracles. They were machines of state power. To understand how the pyramids were built, we must first understand why they were built. Pyramids were not tombs in the modern sense. They were resurrection machines, designed to transform a dead king into an eternal ruler in the afterlife. Egyptian belief held that the pharaoh's survival after death was essential to the survival of Egypt itself. If the king failed to live forever, cosmic order, Ma'at, would collapse. Building a pyramid was therefore not optional. It was a national religious duty. At the same time, pyramids served a political purpose. They were visible proof of royal authority. A king capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers, controlling vast resources, and shaping the landscape itself was a king whose power could not be questioned. The pyramid was ideology carved in stone. One of the most persistent myths is that pyramids were built by slaves, often imagined as suffering masses whipped into submission. Archaeology tells a very different story. Excavations near the Giza Plateau have revealed large, well-organized workers' villages. These settlements contained bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and orderly housing. Skeletal evidence shows that injured workers received medical care, including bone setting and long-term healing. These were not slaves, they were laborers, many of them farmers, working in rotating shifts during the Nile's flood season, when agriculture was impossible. In return, they were fed, housed, and honored for serving the king. Building a pyramid was a form of national service. At peak periods, a single pyramid project may have involved 20,000 to 30,000 workers at a time. This included stone quarry workers, transport crews, engineers and surveyors, carpenters and toolmakers, cooks, bakers and brewers, administrators and scribes. The pyramids were not built by brute force alone. They were built by logistics. Feeding this workforce required enormous planning. Workers consumed massive quantities of bread, beer, meat, and onions daily. This means the state had to control farms, storage systems, transport networks, and distribution on a national scale. The pyramids were as much an administrative achievement as an architectural one. Most pyramid stones were quarried locally. The core blocks came from limestone quarries close to the building sites. Harder stones, such as granite for burial chambers, were transported from hundreds of miles away in southern Egypt. Stone blocks were cut using copper tools, stone hammers, wooden wedges, and water. This technology may seem primitive, but used skillfully and in large numbers, it was extremely effective. The key was not advanced tools, it was labor coordination. One of the greatest misconceptions is that ancient Egyptians lacked the technology to move multi-ton blocks. In reality, they used simple physics. Stones were dragged on wooden sledges across prepared tracks. Evidence shows that workers poured water in front of sledges to reduce friction, making heavy loads easier to move. This method is confirmed by ancient wall reliefs and modern experiments. Transport along the Nile was equally crucial. Stones were floated on barges during flood season, allowing massive materials to move efficiently over long distances. No wheels, no cranes, just physics, planning, and manpower. How were stones lifted to such great heights? There was no single ramp design used for all pyramids. Instead, builders likely adapted methods as construction progressed. Possibilities include straight ramps, zigzag ramps, spiral ramps built around the pyramid, internal ramps hidden within the structure. What matters is not which ramp was used, but that ramps were temporary tools, built, dismantled, and rebuilt as needed. The pyramid was not built from the top down in one piece. It was a living construction site that changed constantly over decades. The Great Pyramid's alignment with the cardinal directions is astonishing, but not mysterious. Egyptian surveyors used astronomical observations, shadow measurements, and repeated verification to achieve precision. They had centuries of experience measuring land after Nile floods. Accuracy was a cultural skill, not a technological miracle. Mistakes did occur. Some pyramids collapsed or were abandoned. These failures prove that pyramid building involved trial and error, not supernatural perfection. Contrary to popular belief, pyramids were not built in impossible time frames. Construction could last 20 to 30 years, an entire reign. When work is spread across decades and supported by a centralized state, even massive projects become achievable. The pyramids were not rushed. They were planned for generations. The idea that aliens built the pyramids is rooted not in evidence but in disbelief. Specifically, disbelief that ancient people, especially non-European ones, could achieve such feats. Archaeology shows clear development. Earlier, smaller pyramids leading to more advanced designs. Tool marks, unfinished blocks, workers' graffiti, and logistical records all point to human builders. There is no gap in knowledge that requires extraterrestrial explanation. The pyramids were built by Egyptians, period. While workers were not slaves, pyramid construction was not easy or safe. Injuries were common, lives were lost. The project demanded sacrifice. But participation also brought status, pride, and a sense of purpose. Workers left marks inside pyramids, names of teams, jokes, and religious references. They knew they were part of something eternal. This was state power expressed through human bodies. The pyramids are often treated as mysterious relics from a lost world. In truth, they are the ultimate expression of early state power. They show what happens when belief, labor, resources, and authority are perfectly aligned. They prove that ancient Egypt was not primitive. It was organized, strategic, and ambitious. The pyramids were not built despite ancient limitations. They were built because Egypt mastered organization. The real truth about pyramid construction is not that it is unknowable, but that it is deeply human. No aliens, no lost technology, no magic, just people working together under a powerful system that demanded the impossible and made it real. When ancient Egypt is discussed, history usually focuses on pharaohs, pyramids, gods, and gold. Yet these symbols represented only a tiny fraction of Egyptian society. More than 90% of the population were ordinary people: farmers, laborers, craftsmen, servants, and workers whose names were never carved into stone. Without them, Egypt's civilization would never have existed. This chapter explores the real daily life of common Egyptians, the people who fed the kingdom, built its monuments, paid its taxes, and endured its hardships. Their story is rarely told, but it is the most important story of all. Ancient Egyptian society was deeply hierarchical, but it was not static. At the top stood the king and elite officials. At the bottom were farmers, laborers, and servants. Between them existed scribes, artisans, soldiers, and priests. Most Egyptians were not slaves. Slavery existed, but it was not the foundation of the economy. The backbone of Egypt was free peasants bound by taxes, labor obligations, and tradition. Their lives were controlled by the Nile, the state, and the gods. They owned little land, had few rights, and left almost no written records. But they built one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. For ordinary Egyptians, life revolved around the Nile River. Its annual flood determined survival. Each year followed the same agricultural cycle. Flood season, fields disappeared underwater. Planting season, crops were sown in fertile mud. Harvest season, grain was collected and taxed. If the flood was too low, famine followed. If it was too high, homes and crops were destroyed. Farmers lived with constant uncertainty. The state monitored flood levels carefully. When harvests failed, peasants still owed taxes. Hunger did not cancel obligation. Most Egyptians were farmers. They worked from sunrise to sunset using simple tools: wooden plows, stone sickles, and hand irrigation. Fields were measured after floods, and land disputes were common. Grain was everything. It was food, currency, tax, and insurance. Farmers stored grain for survival, but much of it went directly to state granaries. Failure to meet quotas could result in beatings, confiscation, or forced labor. There was no retirement. There was no escape. Common Egyptians ate simple but nutritious diets: bread made from barley or emmer wheat, beer, thick and cloudy, consumed daily, onions, lentils, garlic, and vegetables, occasional fish or meat during festivals. Bread and beer were so essential that they were used as payment for labor. Beer was safer than water and provided calories needed for hard work. Hunger was common during bad years. Malnutrition left visible marks on skeletons recovered by archaeologists. Most people lived in small mud brick houses with 1 or 2 rooms. Furniture was minimal. Floors were dirt. Roofs were flat and used for storage or sleeping during hot nights. Families were central to survival. Children worked early. Marriage occurred young. Life expectancy was short, often under 40 years. Despite hardship, family bonds were strong. Storage or sleeping during hot nights. Families were central to survival. Children worked early. Marriage occurred young. Life expectancy was short, often under 40 years. Despite hardship, family bonds were strong. Letters, art, and burial practices show affection, humor, and grief. Ordinary Egyptians laughed, argued, loved, and hoped just like people today. Not everyone farmed. Some became stonecutters, carpenters, potters, metal workers, weavers. Skilled laborers had slightly better lives. They received rations, housing, and sometimes medical care. Still, their work was exhausting and dangerous. Artisans did not express themselves freely. They worked under strict rules, producing state-approved designs. Creativity served ideology. Even free Egyptians owed labor to the state. This system, called corvée labor, required citizens to work on canals, temples, tombs, and pyramids. This was not optional. Refusal meant punishment. Labor service was framed as religious duty, service to the gods and the king. In reality, it was state control of human bodies. For many farmers, corvée labor meant months away from home while families struggled to survive. Life was physically brutal. Broken bones, arthritis, dental disease, and infections were common. Medical knowledge existed, but treatment was limited. Doctors could set bones and treat wounds, but disease and childbirth were deadly. Infant mortality was high. Many women died giving birth. Burials of common people were simple. Graves were shallow. Grave goods were minimal. Eternal life was promised, but rarely guaranteed. Law existed, but it favored elites. Courts were run by officials loyal to the state. Punishments for common people included beatings, forced labor, and mutilation. There was no concept of individual rights. Justice meant maintaining order, not fairness. Fear was a tool of governance. Religion shaped daily life. People prayed for protection, fertility, and health. Amulets were worn to ward off evil. Festivals provided rare joy and communal relief. At the same time, religion justified inequality. Poverty was framed as part of cosmic order. Obedience was holy. The gods offered hope, but also demanded submission. Despite control, common people were not passive. There is evidence of strikes, protests, and work stoppages, especially when rations failed. Workers complained, they fled villages, they sometimes rebelled. These moments remind us that Egyptian society was not perfectly stable. It was held together through constant pressure. Common people left few monuments. They did not write histories. Their voices survive only through bones, tools, and fragments. School books prefer kings because kings leave records. But civilization is not built by rulers alone. The pyramids, temples, and tombs were raised by hands that history forgot. The food that fed priests and kings came from peasant fields. The taxes that funded religion came from common labor. Ancient Egypt was not a miracle civilization. It was a human one. Its greatness rested on the endurance of ordinary people who lived hard lives so others could live forever. Understanding the lives of common Egyptians changes how we see the past. It reveals inequality, resilience, and the true cost of greatness. Egypt did not last for thousands of years because it was perfect. It lasted because millions of ordinary people endured. To the ancient Egyptians, religion was not a separate part of life. It was life. Every flood of the Nile, every harvest, every illness, every death was understood through the will of the gods. Modern people often imagine Egyptian religion as mysterious, exotic, or mystical. But for ancient Egyptians, it was practical, political, and deeply controlling. Religion in Egypt did more than explain the universe. It maintained social order. It justified power, enforced obedience, and gave meaning to suffering. To understand ancient Egypt honestly, we must understand how belief shaped every aspect of existence, from birth to death and beyond. Ancient Egyptians believed the universe was fragile. Without constant divine balance, chaos would destroy everything. This balance was called Ma'at, truth, order, harmony, and justice. Every god, every ritual, and every ruler existed to protect it. The gods were not distant. They controlled the sun, the river, fertility, disease, and death. Each city had its own patron deities, but over time a vast and complex pantheon emerged. These gods were deeply human in behavior. They fought, loved, betrayed, and punished. This made them relatable, but also unpredictable. Life was dangerous because the gods were powerful and emotional. Religion offered explanation but never certainty. The greatest enemy in Egyptian belief was not evil. It was chaos. Chaos meant drought, invasion, famine, rebellion, and death. Everything Egyptians feared could be explained as the breakdown of Ma'at. Religion taught that chaos was always waiting to return. Order had to be actively maintained through rituals, offerings, prayers, and obedience to authority. If people disobeyed the gods, or the king, chaos would follow. This belief made obedience sacred. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He was the chief priest of Egypt, responsible for maintaining Ma'at. Every successful harvest, every military victory, every stable year proved that the king was favored by the gods. If disaster struck, blame could fall on the ruler, but more often it fell on the people. Perhaps rituals were neglected. Perhaps obedience weakened. Religion shifted responsibility away from power and towards submission. The king stood at the center of the religious system, but the system protected the king. Egyptian temples were not places of public worship like modern churches. They were sacred estates where gods were believed to physically live. Priests performed daily rituals, washing, dressing, feeding the god's statue. Temples controlled vast lands, herds, workshops, and labor forces. They were economic giants. The gods were wealthy and priests managed that wealth. Religion was not charity, it was administration. Ordinary people rarely entered temples. Their access to the divine was limited. This separation reinforced hierarchy. The gods spoke to priests, priests served the king, and the people obeyed. To Egyptians, death was not escape. It was judgment. They believed every person faced a trial in the afterlife. The heart, seat of morality, was weighed against the feather of truth. A good life meant eternal existence. Failure meant annihilation. There was no forgiveness. There was no second chance. This belief system encouraged moral behavior, but also fear. People obeyed laws not because they were fair, but because eternal survival depended on compliance. The body mattered deeply. Egyptians believed the soul needed the body to survive. Without preservation, the afterlife was impossible. Mummification evolved over centuries into a complex ritual involving organ removal, drying, wrapping, and magical protection. This process was expensive. Elites could afford full mummification. Common people could not. Many were buried with minimal preparation, undermining the promise of eternal life. The afterlife, like life itself, was unequal. To navigate the dangers of the afterlife, Egyptians used funerary texts, spells, prayers, and instructions designed to protect the soul. These texts were not universal. They were customized and costly. The better your spells, the safer your journey. Salvation was not moral alone. It was financial. Egyptian morality emphasized obedience, humility, and loyalty. These values supported social stability, not personal freedom. There was no concept of equality before the gods. Status mattered. Power mattered. Wealth mattered. Religion taught people to accept their place. Suffering was not injustice. It was destiny. Religion was not abstract. People wore amulets, spoke spells, and performed household rituals to protect against illness, evil spirits, and misfortune. Magic was not opposed to religion. It was part of it. The universe operated through hidden forces that could be influenced with correct knowledge. Priests controlled this knowledge. Religion offered comfort, but it also enforced fear. Eternal punishment, divine wrath, and cosmic annihilation were powerful motivators. A society that believes the universe punishes rebellion is easier to govern. Religion turned authority into destiny. During periods of famine, invasion, or political collapse, religious confidence weakened. People questioned the gods. New beliefs emerged. Old rituals lost power. These moments show that religion was not unshakable. It depended on results. Belief survived because it worked, until it didn't. Modern portrayals of Egyptian religion focus on mystery and wonder. The reality is more complex. Religion was not just belief. It was structure. It organized society, justified inequality, and maintained control. The gods did not rule Egypt alone. People used the gods to rule people. Ancient Egyptian religion was not primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated system designed to explain the world and stabilize society. It gave hope to the fearful, meaning to suffering, and eternity to the powerful. But it also demanded obedience, accepted inequality, and punished resistance. This dual nature, comfort and control, is what allowed Egyptian civilization to endure for thousands of years. Religion was not separate from power. Religion was power. Ancient Egypt is often described as a world ruled entirely by men. Pharaohs, priests, generals, and officials whose names dominate monuments and textbooks. At first glance, women appear to exist only in the background. Wives, mothers, dancers, or mourners carved quietly into reliefs. But this impression is misleading. Beneath the surface of Egypt's male-dominated political imagery lay a society where women possessed far more rights, influence, and power than in almost any other ancient civilization. Women in ancient Egypt were not equals in every sense, but neither were they invisible. Their power was real, complex, and often hidden, exercised through family, religion, economy, and at rare moments, the throne itself. For most Egyptian women, life revolved around the household. They managed homes, raised children, prepared food, brewed beer, and wove cloth. These tasks were not considered insignificant. In a society where survival depended on food storage, cleanliness, and family stability, domestic labor was essential. Women could own property, inherit land, buy and sell goods, and enter contracts in their own names. This legal independence was extraordinary in the ancient world. A woman did not need a male guardian to conduct business or appear in court. Marriage was common but not legally rigid. Women could divorce their husbands and reclaim property. Marriage contracts often protected women's financial rights, including compensation in cases of abandonment. This legal autonomy did not eliminate inequality, but it gave women leverage rarely seen elsewhere. Motherhood carried immense social weight. Lineage was crucial in Egypt, especially among elites. A child's legitimacy often depended on the status of the mother. Royal women, in particular, derived power through their ability to produce heirs. The title King's Mother was one of the most powerful in the kingdom. A queen mother could influence succession, policy, and court politics. Even when women did not rule directly, they shaped who did. Bloodlines mattered as much as crowns. Religion offered women avenues of influence unavailable in politics. Goddesses played central roles in Egyptian belief. Deities associated with motherhood, magic, protection, love, and kingship were overwhelmingly female. Women served as priestesses, musicians, dancers, and ritual participants in temples. Some held prestigious titles tied to major cults. Religious authority brought wealth, status, and political relevance. Magic, in particular, was closely associated with women. Healing spells, protective amulets, and household rituals were often performed by women. This gave them spiritual authority inside the home and community. Religion empowered women, even as it reinforced cosmic order. Most women were not formally educated, but neither were most men. Literacy was limited to scribes and elites. Some elite women learned to read and write, especially within royal or priestly families. Women could be scribes, though rarely. When they were, it signaled extraordinary privilege. More often, women transmitted knowledge orally. Recipes, medical practices, rituals, and traditions passed from mother to daughter. Power does not always leave written records. Despite their rights, women were not equal to men in every sphere. Political authority was overwhelmingly male. Military leadership was closed to women. Most official titles belonged to men. Art and inscriptions prioritized male achievement. Women's contributions were often framed through relationships to husbands, fathers, or sons. Power existed, but it was conditional. Royal women were not passive figures. Queens acted as diplomats, advisors, and symbols of continuity. Marriages were tools of alliance. A queen could stabilize a reign simply by embodying legitimacy. Some queens wielded power behind the scenes, influencing decisions without formal authority. Their names might not appear in triumphal inscriptions, but their presence shaped outcomes. Court politics was a family affair. On rare occasions, women did not just influence power, they took it. The most famous example is Hatshepsut, one of the most successful rulers in Egyptian history. Rather than ruling quietly as a regent, she declared herself king. To legitimize her rule, she adopted male royal imagery, wearing the traditional crown and even the false beard. This was not deception, it was political language. Kingship was male by definition, so she presented herself accordingly. Her reign was peaceful, prosperous, and marked by monumental building projects and trade expansion. Yet after her death, her memory was deliberately attacked. Statues were destroyed, names were erased. Her success was remembered. Ancient Egypt is often remembered as a land of temples, rituals, and eternal order. But beneath this image lay a constant struggle for survival. Egypt did not exist in isolation. It was surrounded by rivals, enemies, trading partners, and ambitious empires. War was not an exception. It was a regular feature of Egyptian history. At the same time, diplomacy was just as important as violence. Egypt survived for thousands of years, not because it always won battles, but because it learned when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to adapt. This chapter reveals the true face of Egyptian power beyond the Nile. Armies, borders, propaganda, treaties, and the fragile balance between domination and collapse. Egypt's geography offered both protection and vulnerability. Deserts shielded it on the east and west, but the Nile Valley itself was narrow and exposed. Control of border regions was essential. Egypt fought wars for three main reasons: defense against invasion, resources such as gold, copper, timber, and slaves, prestige, which reinforced royal authority. A strong king was expected to be a warrior. Peace without power was seen as weakness. Early Egyptian armies were not professional standing forces. Soldiers were farmers and laborers called up when needed. Over time, especially during periods of expansion, Egypt developed more organized military units. Weapons were simple but effective: spears and shields, bows and arrows, axes and daggers. Discipline mattered more than technology. Egyptian armies relied on coordination, formations, and leadership rather than brute force. Egypt faced threats from every direction. To the south, Nubian kingdoms challenged Egypt's control of gold-rich regions. To the east, peoples from the Levant threatened trade routes. To the west, desert tribes raided settlements. Later, powerful empires such as the Hittites, Assyrians, and Persians would challenge Egypt directly. Foreigners were often depicted as chaotic, ugly, and inferior in Egyptian art. This was propaganda, not reality. Many enemies were highly organized and technologically advanced. During its strongest periods, Egypt did not merely defend itself, it expanded aggressively. Pharaohs launched campaigns deep into foreign lands, claiming territory, tribute, and captives. These campaigns were carefully recorded in temples and monuments. Kings were shown towering over enemies, striking them down with ease. These images were symbolic, not documentary. Victory reinforced divine kingship. Even limited success was portrayed as total domination. One of the most famous conflicts in ancient history is the Battle of Kadesh, fought during the reign of Ramesses II against the Hittite Empire. According to Egyptian records, Ramesses II single-handedly defeated the enemy and saved Egypt from disaster. His image dominates temple walls, heroic and invincible. The reality was different. The battle ended in a stalemate. Neither side achieved decisive victory. Egypt did not conquer Hittite territory. Yet Ramesses turned the battle into a propaganda triumph. His version became history, carved in stone and repeated endlessly. This moment reveals a crucial truth. In ancient Egypt, controlling the narrative mattered more than controlling the battlefield. Egypt was not always at war. In fact, diplomacy was one of its greatest strengths. Treaties, marriages, and trade agreements helped maintain stability. The peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittites, after Kadesh, is the oldest known international peace treaty in history. Royal marriages were tools of diplomacy. Foreign princesses entered Egyptian courts to seal alliances. Interestingly, Egyptian princesses were rarely sent abroad, an indication of Egypt's belief in its own superiority. Diplomacy allowed Egypt to survive when military dominance was no longer possible. Egypt built extensive fortifications along its borders, especially in Nubia and the Sinai. Fortresses controlled trade routes, monitored movement, and projected power. Military presence was permanent in contested regions. Garrisons collected taxes, enforced loyalty, and suppressed rebellion. Empire was expensive. Maintaining control required constant resources and manpower. War fueled Egypt's economy. Captives became laborers. Tribute flowed into temples. Resources funded monuments. But war also drained the state. Campaigns were costly. Soldiers needed supplies. Losses weakened agriculture. As Egypt's power declined, war became unsustainable. Over time, Egypt faced enemies it could not easily defeat. New technologies, iron weapons, cavalry, advanced tactics changed warfare. Egypt's traditional army struggled to adapt. Internal corruption weakened leadership. Foreign mercenaries filled the ranks. Eventually, Egypt became the prize rather than the conqueror. Egypt fell to Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Yet Egyptian culture survived. Conquerors adopted Egyptian titles, rituals, and gods. Even in defeat, Egypt shaped its rulers. This resilience was not military, it was cultural. War and diplomacy reveal Egypt's true nature as a political state, not a timeless utopia. Egypt survived through strategy, compromise, and adaptation. It was strong when it could be, and flexible when it had to be. Ancient Egypt was not eternally victorious. It lost battles, it retreated, it negotiated. Its greatness lay not in invincibility but in endurance. Swords built Egypt's empire. Diplomacy preserved it. Culture outlived it. For centuries, ancient Egypt appeared timeless. Its kings eternal, its gods powerful, its order unbreakable. Temple walls proclaimed stability. Priests promised balance. Pharaohs insisted the universe itself depended on their rule. But beneath this image of permanence, Egypt was always vulnerable. Its survival depended on fragile systems. Climate stability, efficient administration, loyal elites, and the belief of ordinary people. When these systems failed, one by one, Egypt entered periods of collapse that revealed a hard truth. No civilization, no matter how glorious, is immune to decline. This chapter explores how corruption, climate change, economic strain, and political failure combined to push ancient Egypt toward repeated breakdowns, and why recovery became harder each time. Ancient Egyptian ideology insisted that order, Ma'at, was permanent and divinely protected. History was portrayed as a smooth, unbroken line of kings maintaining cosmic balance. But archaeology tells a different story. Egypt experienced multiple collapses, often called intermediate periods, when central authority broke down. These were not brief interruptions. They were traumatic eras marked by famine, violence, decentralization, and fear. Collapse was not an accident. It was structural. At the heart of Egypt's survival was the Nile. When the Nile failed, everything failed. Scientific evidence from lake sediments, tree rings, and ancient records shows that Egypt suffered periods of prolonged drought. Nile floods became weak or unpredictable. Crops failed, food shortages spread. The state depended on agricultural surplus to feed workers, fund temples, pay officials, and supply armies. Without surplus, the entire system unraveled. Climate change was not gradual from the human perspective. It was catastrophic. When floods failed, hunger followed. Texts from collapse periods describe starvation so severe that families abandoned children. Lawlessness increased. Tomb robberies surged. People lost faith, not only in the king, but in the gods themselves. If the pharaoh was truly chosen by the gods, why had order collapsed? Famine exposed the lie of divine protection. As resources declined, corruption intensified. Officials hoarded grain. Priests protected temple wealth while villages starved. Tax demands continued even when harvests failed. The gap between elite and common people widened dangerously. When people believe the system no longer protects them, obedience collapses. Authority becomes a burden rather than a shield. Corruption did not just weaken Egypt, it delegitimized it. For much of its history, Egypt poured enormous resources into monuments, temples, and royal tombs. These projects reinforced ideology, but they were expensive. During times of stress, monument building became unsustainable. Labor obligations increased. Taxes rose. Resentment grew. The very symbols meant to prove eternal power became reminders of inequality. Stone could not feed the hungry. Strong leadership mattered in ancient Egypt. When kings were competent, crises could be managed. When they were weak, everything fell apart. During collapse periods, royal succession became unstable. Short reigns, rival claimants, and regional rulers shattered unity. Governors and military leaders acted independently. Egypt ceased to be one kingdom and became many competing states. Unity had always been enforced. Without enforcement, it vanished. As Egypt weakened internally, external threats increased. Trade routes collapsed. Border defenses faltered. Foreign groups pushed inward. Some invaded violently. Others settled gradually. One of the most dramatic episodes involved the so-called Sea Peoples, migrant groups who destabilized much of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Egypt survived their attacks, but only barely. Defense drained resources Egypt no longer had. Trade networks were essential to Egypt's economy. Copper, tin, timber, and luxury goods came from abroad. When regional systems collapsed, trade stopped. Without imports, weapons production slowed. Elite lifestyles suffered. Temples lost income. Economic collapse reinforced political collapse. Egypt became poorer and weaker. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of collapse was psychological. Egyptian society was built on belief. Belief in the king, the gods, and cosmic order. When famine, corruption, and invasion proved that belief false, people adapted. Local cults replaced state religion. Personal survival mattered more than ideology. Loyalty became transactional. Once belief breaks, systems crumble quickly. Egypt did recover more than once. Strong rulers restored order, rebuilt institutions, and revived ideology. But each recovery required more force and produced less stability. The system became rigid. Adaptation slowed. Innovation was feared. Egypt learned how to restore the past, but not how to reinvent itself. In later centuries, Egypt faced new challenges. Iron weapons, cavalry warfare, globalized empires, and aggressive neighbors. Egypt's political and military systems were designed for an earlier world. Attempts to adapt were limited and slow. When collapse came again, recovery did not. The ruins of abandoned cities, unfinished monuments, and looted tombs tell a story not of mystery, but of consequence. Egypt collapsed not because it forgot its gods, but because its systems were too fragile, too unequal, and too dependent on perfect conditions. When the Nile failed, everything failed. Modern societies often imagine collapse as sudden or impossible. Egypt proves otherwise. Collapse is not a single event. It is a process. Slow, visible, and ignored until it becomes unstoppable. Climate stress, inequality, corruption, and rigid institutions destroyed one of the world's greatest civilizations. Not overnight, but inevitably, ancient Egypt did not fall because it lost its magic. It fell because it was human. Its systems demanded stability in an unstable world. When reality changed, Egypt could not change fast enough. The pyramids still stand. The gods are remembered, but the civilization that built them could not survive its own limits. This is the true lesson of Egypt's collapse. Not mystery, but warning. Ancient Egypt did not end in a single dramatic moment. There was no final battle, no sudden collapse that erased its culture overnight. Instead, Egypt's end was a long, uneven process marked by conquest, adaptation, and survival. Foreign rulers came and went, but Egypt itself endured, changing shape, language, and power structures while preserving a deep cultural memory that refused to disappear. This final chapter tells the true story of how ancient Egypt lost its independence, how it survived under foreign rule, and why its legacy still shapes the world today. By the first millennium BCE, Egypt was no longer the unstoppable power it once had been. Its strategic location, agricultural wealth, and symbolic prestige made it a target for rising empires. Egypt was no longer the conqueror. Egypt had become the reward. Foreign powers did not invade because Egypt was weak alone. They invaded because Egypt was valuable. One of the first empires to truly break Egypt's illusion of invincibility was Assyria. Armed with iron weapons, disciplined armies, and brutal tactics, the Assyrians overwhelmed Egyptian defenses. They sacked cities, humiliated kings, and exposed the limits of Egypt's military traditions. Although Assyrian rule was short-lived, the psychological damage was lasting. For the first time, Egypt learned that its gods and traditions could not stop foreign domination. The Persians conquered Egypt not as raiders but as administrators. They integrated Egypt into a vast imperial system, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Persian rulers adopted Egyptian titles, honored temples, and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs. This was not respect, it was strategy. Egypt was no longer the center of the world. It was a province. Yet Egyptian religion, language, and daily life continued. The civilization adapted without surrendering its identity. In 332 BCE, Egypt welcomed a new conqueror, Alexander the Great. Unlike previous invaders, Alexander presented himself as a liberator from Persian rule. He respected Egyptian traditions, visited sacred sites, and founded a city that would change history, Alexandria. Alexander's conquest marked a turning point. Egypt entered the Greek world, not as an equal, but as a cultural powerhouse within a new global order. After Alexander's death, Egypt fell to one of his generals. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled for nearly 3 centuries. These rulers were Greek by culture, but Egyptian by necessity. They learned local customs, supported temples, and presented themselves as pharaohs. Hieroglyphs continued. Priests remained powerful. At the same time, Greek language, philosophy, and science flourished. Especially in Alexandria, Egypt became a bridge between ancient traditions and new ideas. This was not the death of Egypt. It was transformation. The last ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt was Cleopatra Zevan, one of history's most misunderstood figures. Cleopatra was not merely a romantic figure. She was a skilled political strategist, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply committed to Egyptian identity. Unlike many predecessors, she spoke Egyptian and embraced local traditions. Her alliances with Roman leaders were acts of survival, not seduction. But Rome was too powerful. When Cleopatra was defeated, Egypt lost its final chance at independence. Under Roman rule, Egypt became a critical grain supplier. Its wealth fed Rome's population and funded imperial ambition. Roman emperors ruled Egypt as pharaohs, but real power lay elsewhere. Egyptian religion was tolerated, but gradually marginalized. Temples declined, priests lost influence. Egypt's role shifted from sacred center to economic engine. The world had changed, and Egypt was no longer shaping it. Egyptian religion did not vanish overnight. Temples remained active for centuries. Rituals continued. Hieroglyphs were still carved, but support faded. Christianity spread. Pagan traditions were discouraged, then banned. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in the 4th century CE. When writing disappeared, memory followed. That moment, not conquest, marked the true end of ancient Egypt, even as political power vanished. Egypt's influence lived on. Greek philosophy absorbed Egyptian knowledge. Roman religion borrowed Egyptian gods. Modern science inherited Egyptian mathematics and medicine. Art, architecture, and symbolism echoed across civilizations. Egypt shaped the world long after it stopped ruling it. Civilizations do not die when borders change. They die when memory fades. Egypt survived through culture, adaptation, and influence. Its ideas traveled farther than its armies ever did. Even today, Egypt defines how we imagine the ancient world. Ancient Egypt did not fall because it was conquered. It fell because the world outgrew the systems that once sustained it. Yet its legacy outlived every empire that ruled it. The pyramids still stand. The gods are remembered. The story continues. Egypt teaches us that greatness is not eternal, but influence can be. Power fades, culture adapts, memory survives. Ancient Egypt ended as a state, but it never ended as a civilization. That is its true immortality.